We're going to continue to talk about how animals know what to eat and what not to eat, and we're going to focus on principles of diet selection. In this presentation, we're going to talk specifically about how animals respond to new foods in new places. This is Integrated Rangeland Management at the University of Idaho, and I'm Karen Launchbaugh. So, which foods to eat and avoid? Simple question, but out on the range, remember there's lots of plants that are poisonous. In fact, most plants have secondary compounds on them. And animals, we know, have the ability to determine what is good or bad based on feedback, but how can they tell? They eat dozens of foods a day. So how do they know if they got sick, which made them ill or which made them feel better? That's the question. How do they do it? Well, first thing that animals do is they are very cautious at sampling novel foods. Animals, including ourselves, have this characteristic called neophobia. We have this fear of new things, and in this case, fear of new foods. We and animals generally take very few bites of new foods. And this is an experiment that was done by Fred Provenza. And it just over 9 days, he just looked to see how much rice these sheep would eat. And on day 1 and 2, they didn't eat very much. 3, 4, 5, 6, they kept eating more and more. And then Fred put a novel flavor on the food. I think it was cinnamon. He put some cinnamon on that rice, and it was new to them again. So they backed off. But it only took them a couple days to get back onto the rice and start learning about it. So animals avoid eating novel foods, and they quit eating familiar foods if they start to get a new flavor. Here's a video that has some kind of quirky music in the background, but it shows you how animals avoid novel foods.
Neophobia means the fear of anything new. Animals are neophobic with regards to food. In other words, they don't like to eat new foods. This group of lambs is being offered a novel food. They have never seen Russian olive before. Since the lambs don't know if this food is safe to eat, they sample it cautiously. This gives the body time to provide feedback about a plant's nutrients and toxins. These lambs were given Russian olive every morning for a week. This is their response to Russian olive on the 7th day. Their number of bites per minute has increased dramatically over their first try. Once the lambs were familiar with Russian olive, they were given a choice between Russian olive and carrageenan, another plant they had never seen before. As shown here, they prefer the familiar food to the novel food. After about a week of exposure to carrageenan, the lambs are returned to the pen and again given a choice between Russian olive and carrageenan. Now that they are familiar with both, they eat both. Neophobia may be one reason that livestock refuse to eat weeds, even if they are nutritious. Mature animals aren't likely to try new foods if they have nutritious, familiar alternatives.
All right, so not everything is novel, but how does an animal decide what to eat if they're eating many foods a day? Here's an experiment done by Beth Burritt and Fred Provenza. Pretty interesting experiment. One day they gave a set of sheep oats, barley, alfalfa pellets, plus some corn and some rye, and then they made him sick. So they gave him a meal with 5 foods, and then they made him sick, and they asked the sheep, which food do you blame? Okay, rye was the novel food. So on day 2, when they offered the sheep these same foods, the sheep did not eat rye because that was the new one. But what was interesting is they also went off corn. Corn had made these sheep ill in a previous experiment, and so they blamed this illness on foods that had previously made them ill. Barley, oats, and alfalfa were all very familiar to these sheep, so they continued to eat these foods even after they became ill. So bottom line is, if you get ill after eating a food, you and all animals will first blame the novel food. Secondly, they'll blame foods that made them ill in the past. I also was wondering if animals would eat Would they blame foods that were similar to other foods that they didn't like? I was mostly interested in things like sagebrush, where there's dozens of kinds of sagebrush in Idaho or in the Northwest, and I was wondering if sheep had to learn every single sagebrush. They all have some similar characteristics. So in this case, instead of sage flavor, I used cinnamon, and what I did was I had a set of sheep and I averted them to cinnamon flavored rice. The other set of sheep actually formed a preference for rice, and then I asked them, how do you feel about eating cinnamon flavored wheat? So I give them a new food, similar to a food that had made them sick in the past or not. And the black bars are the ones that had been averted to cinnamon rice, and I couldn't fool them. They didn't like cinnamon rice. They realized there was something bad about cinnamon, and when I put it on wheat, they also avoided the cinnamon flavored wheat. Okay, cinnamon is not a really common food in the environment of sheep, but it is very common in our food. So if you got averted to cinnamon on your toast, you might also be averted to cinnamon candies or cinnamon liqueurs, all sorts of things that have cinnamon that you wouldn't like because you're averted to that flavor. So it turns out that there is a characteristic called generalization, and that animals will avoid foods that are similar to other foods that made them ill in the past. So novelty is the key, but there are lots of other factors. There are lots of ways that animals have to figure out what made them ill when they're eating several foods at once. Novelty is the first one. They blame novel foods when they get sick. Prior experience, if the food made them ill in the past. Generalization, again, if a food is similar to other foods that made them sick in the past, they'll avoid that one. They also will avoid foods that they ate a lot. So if they eat a big meal and they've got one thing they ate a lot of in that meal and they get sick, they'll blame it on that food that they ate the most of. Also, timing is important. When an animal eats a meal and they get sick, if all other things being equal, they might blame the food that they ate last. Now let's talk a little bit not on what to eat, but what about how to eat. So animals, we know they need to learn what to eat, but what's interesting is they also need to know how to eat. They have to develop foraging skills. Many of the forages, the plants that animals encounter out in the environment, are kind of difficult to get the very best parts off of, and animals over time really gain the skills to do that, called foraging skills. Just in case you underestimate how hard it is for animals to learn some of these foraging skills, here's a video of goats trying to eat blackbrush that was created by this Behave group out of Utah State University.
This video demonstrates the importance of knowing how to eat a new kind of forage. This goat has never seen blackbrush before. He sees others eating it, but hasn't quite gotten the technique himself. Experienced animals know how to select twigs and stems and snap them off easily. This goat's bites per minute far exceed those of the inexperienced goat. The better an animal is at knowing how to eat a variety of vegetation, the more successful he can be at sustaining himself, even on less nutritious forage.
Okay, now I'm going to show you just a little bit of research from a friend of mine, Enrique Flores. He was interested how hard it is for animals to learn, say, eating grass versus eating shrubs. So he just raised two sets of sheep. They were raised on mostly alfalfa pellets, and one group got crested wheatgrass in pots, so they were the grass eaters. Another group got serviceberry in pots, and they were the shrub eaters, and they were experienced with eating either grass or shrubs for a number of weeks. And then after these weeks of training, they were tested to see figure out what their ingestion rate is, how fast could they eat grasses or shrubs. And here's what Enrique found. He found that on the left side that sheep that were raised eating grass definitely eat grass faster. Not a ton faster, but faster. The shrub eating goats actually ate grass pretty well, but if you look at shrub eating on the right hand side, you'll see that the shrub eating goats ate shrubs even better than the grass eating sheep. So in other words, if sheep were raised on eating grass, they're probably good at eating grass and not as good at eating shrubs. Animals that are raised on eating shrubs are probably pretty good at eating shrubs. And this explains a lot in nature where animals that are raised in the plains, for example, where there's very few shrubs, and then they're moved to the southwest, and they really don't have the skills to eat the shrubs that are in the southwestern rangelands. So these were some ideas about how animals learn what and how to eat. Again, you can find more on behave.net.